Now let's welcome Professor Fanzo to give the Rachel Carson Distinguished Lecture. Thank you, Professor Fanzo. The floor is yours.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Jack, and for the invitation. And I'm very honored to be able to present for the Rachel Carson Distinguished Lecture. Jack had mentioned Silent Spring as her seminal work, but I just wanted to pull this out. I read this last summer, and this is Rachel Carson's three-part series on oceans. And I really recommend it. It's written a long time ago before Silent Spring, but it's still relevant today, the work that she produced 60, 70 years ago. So it's really quite incredible. So I feel very honored to be able to present today. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to talk about this idea of the importance of evidence and data to hold a spotlight on food systems. So why do we work and why do we focus on food systems as in my team and for many of us who are working on issues around food security, nutrition, and climate? Well, food systems are victims of climate change. They're transgressors of climate change. And they're also part of the solution in mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I'll walk through a little bit of why we do this and then get a bit into some of the work that we're doing. The first issue around climate is that it's impacting food systems as well as many other systems relevant for diets and nutrition. We know that long-term climate projections as well as near-term climate shocks will have impacts on water quality, food production quantity and quality, and disruptions across supply chains, infrastructure. And this will have impacts on water insecurity, food insecurity, as well as energy insecurity and in the home environment. And this can have significant negative implications for the kinds of diets that people get access to, as well as increases in infectious disease and stress that can impact nutrition outcomes. And this is really this pathway of climate impacts to nutrition is what my team focuses on a lot, and I'll talk a bit about that. Now, at the same time, food systems are also contributing to environmental degradation and pollution and climate. We know that about 26% of greenhouse gases, somewhere between 24 to 34%, depending on how you do the calculations, are coming from food systems in the forms of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And when we look at where these greenhouse gases are coming from, and this is a work done by Poor and Nemesek, shows that most of the greenhouse gases coming from the food system are from agriculture production and land use change, a lot of that being deforestation. Another study by Kripa and colleagues looked further along supply chains and waste, and that's the contribution of about 34% of total greenhouse gas emissions produced globally are coming from food systems. But still, agriculture production and land use change are the big greenhouse gas emissions from food systems. But there's also a lot of other environmental issues. When we look at land use, agriculture is using somewhere between 40 to 50% of arable land to grow food. And a lot of that is not being managed well and is currently unsustainable, which contributes to biodiversity loss and deforestation. We know that agriculture uses about 70% of all the freshwater resources, and it's contributing to freshwater pollution through eutrophication, nitrogen and phosphorus runoff into waterways. And we are dealing with major extinctions. Biodiversity is being lost across plants and animals. And now we've replaced much of the wild mammals and wild birds with livestock, be it cattle and poultry livestock and pork, pigs. So we're seeing that food systems are significant contributors to climate as well as environmental degradation. And what a lot of this has resulted in is that many people around the world are struggling to meet their dietary needs, and nutrition remains a huge challenge across the world. We still have 733 million people who go to bed hungry. 148 million children are stunted or chronically undernourished. 45 million children are acutely malnourished, or what is called wasted, and these children are at very high risk of mortality. 37 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, and 2.5 billion adults are overweight or obese. And much of this malnutrition burden that we see is attributed to the kinds of diets we consume. 2.8 billion people cannot afford what is considered a healthy diet, a diet that meets basic nutritional needs and requirements and is heart protective and health protective. We know that food prices remain quite high for many people. There's food inflation around the world, which makes it harder to access those healthy diets. And 11 million deaths annually are attributed to poor diets, which is just incredible that diets, which are meant to nourish us, are killing us now. The other big reason why we work on food systems is really that if we want to meet the Paris climate change targets to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to take action on food systems. And what this graph shows is that even if we fix the energy sector, transportation, buildings, move away from fossil fuels across those sectors, if we don't do anything on food, we won't meet the climate agreement. But we have to do many things across food systems. And the second point of this slide is this hatched bar halfway down, this 67% chance of staying below 1.5. We have to do many things across agriculture production systems, improving efficiency, increasing yields in some parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But even doing those things won't get us to this threshold. If we eat a more plant-dominant diet, we consume enough calories to meet our needs, but not over-consume calories. It will get us somewhat to that threshold, but not enough. Reducing food loss and waste will get us somewhat there. But what this last bar shows is that we need to do all of these things at scale if we want to stay below 1.5. Another reason why we work on food systems is that we see that in many resource-constrained settings, and vulnerable and marginalized populations are being left behind. They need prioritization. Many people are struggling because of where they live, their socioeconomic status, the socio-political status of where they are, biological needs, is resulting in increased exposure, sensitivity, and the lacking capacity to adapt to climate change. And this is having all kinds of influences on nutrition outcomes. So people in resource-constrained areas are more likely to be exposed to climate change health threats. People with poor food access are likely to become more severely food insecure during extreme weather events. And people with chronic undernutrition are more likely to have serious health implications. So one of the ways that, and reasons why we focus on food systems is that we are convinced that if we can prioritize these populations and ensure they have food security and ensure that they can adapt to climate change, we will improve nutrition outcomes for those who really need the care and attention. So food systems are really a lifeline between climate and nutrition. We know that food is produced on landscapes, it's stored, it's transported, it's processed, it's packaged, it hits markets, and people buy those foods and bring them home and they consume them or they throw them out. This whole food system, these food supply chains, is very much linked to climate resilience and environmental sustainability and improving diets and optimal nutrition if those food systems are managed in the right way. So I'm going to talk a bit about our research, what we've been doing over the last decade, and how it informs our current and future research portfolios. And I'm going to walk you through the very global kind of work we've done to our hyper-local work that we've done. And I'll walk you through 4 areas of research. So the first is really this idea of prioritizing and framing food systems in climate and international development global agendas. So why are we doing this? Well, it's really important for policymakers to know that food systems are critical as a solution for climate change and for better health and livelihoods and environmental sustainability. But the international development agenda, where many governing bodies are operating, be it during the UN General Assembly, in the COP climate change meetings, in the Sustainable Development to 2030 agenda, that international development community, it's a crowded space, easily distracted, and it's a gatekeeping space. Attention towards food security goes through ebbs and flows. But more recently, with climate change, with the wars that are happening around the world, and the post-pandemic economic downturn, more policymakers are starting to look at food systems and how they can transform them in positive directions. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is ensuring that food security and food systems remain very high on the political agenda. And we do this by providing guidance and evidence of their importance in sustainable development. So Jack had mentioned we've been doing a lot of work. We've developed a lot of global reports and articulated what are food systems and why are they so important for sustainable development, that be economic, social, environmental issues. And we've produced many reports from different groups, thousands of people involved to help raise and draw attention to this notion of food systems. And the last few years, the attention's been more on the importance of food systems and integrating it into planetary health and climate change agendas. So many reports were coming out at that time as well. And one of the really seminal papers, and I would argue Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was highly influenced, but it was very influential to this report, and it was the Eat Lancet Commission. And this Eat Lancet Commission set out scientific targets for diets and what the world should consume if we want to stay within this construct of planetary boundaries that was developed by Johan Rockström. And these are 9 boundaries that we don't want to cross. And if we want our world to be in a safe operating space. And you can see from 2009 to 2023, we've already crossed some of these boundaries from 3 to now 6, where we're starting to create unstable Earth systems, and we're beginning to operate in this area, which is less safe and less just. And the Eat Lancet Commission felt that food is an important vehicle to stay within these boundaries, but we need to eat a certain diet. And this diet that was recommended was a very plant-based diet. A lot of fruits, veg, nuts, seeds, whole grains, and less animal source foods, which are quite taxing on the environment And some animal source foods produce more significant greenhouse gas emissions. But the world is consuming a very different diet than this Eat Lancet diet. If we look at this health boundary of the recommended Eat Lancet diet, the world is consuming way more red meat, starchy staples, and eggs outside the boundary, and not enough of some of the healthy ingredients like fruits, vegetables, whole greens, seafood, nuts, legumes, and seeds. So it really set out this idea that we need to establish targets for the food systems to stay within these planetary boundaries. And it was quite influential, one of the most influential documents that has influenced and garnered the attention of policymakers. So we've been doing a lot of this work at the global level and global cooperation. And we've learned a few things that if you flood the landscape with this notion of that food systems are important, you can garner attention, but that attention is often transient and temporary. Policymakers have a lot of different priorities, a lot of emergencies, like we're seeing now. The US is very distracted by something very important, the upcoming election and wars around the world. So we need to keep pushing on global policymakers. But we also know that while food systems have reached a higher priority, policymakers often don't know how to navigate such a complex system, and they're unaware of trade-offs and which levers to invest in. So it's really important to provide data and evidence if we really want there to be evidence-based decision-making. And so while global governance matters for food systems, there's a real need for national and local context, governance, solutions, investments, if we want communities to reap benefits and adapt. And so that's why we started working on the evidence base and data at the national system. So improving national food system decision-making with better food system science. And we did this because, as I said, policymakers are often in the dark on how their food systems are performing in their countries, what are the potential near and long-term risks, and how and where they should intervene. So a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last few years is developing data tools, metrics, and models to unpack some of the most complex food system science issues. And I'll just present two projects that we have going on, the Food Systems Dashboard and the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. The dashboard it is a tool to help guide diagnosing and decision-making across food systems. And what it is it's a complete view of food systems. It brings together data across multiple public sources, and it populates data across drivers of food systems change, different components of food supplies, and outcomes of food systems across almost every country in the world. And we developed this dashboard to make it really easy for people who are not comfortable working with big data or complex databases. And we did this with the idea of, if you go to the dashboard, you can describe food systems, you can diagnose how they're doing, and you can take decisions on them. And so the interface is very easy to navigate. You don't have to be an expert on data and data filters and disaggregation of data. It's a very visually appealing, easy tool in that it creates maps, it creates graphs with very little knowledge on food systems data. Another project that we worked on as part of the Global Food Systems Dashboard was this notion of subnational dashboards. As many of you know, food systems are highly contextual within a country. And if you're living in a rural place versus an urban place, your food system and the kinds of foods that are grown and accessed by consumers are very different. And so what we've done is we've created 7 subnational dashboards. And what I think are some of the more complicated countries because of their size and their geography: Indonesia, Nigeria, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Mozambique. We're developing one for India and a few others. And we did this in collaboration with the governments of these countries. They chose the indicators that were most important for their settings. And you can navigate across these dashboards and look at data subnationally across, in this case, showing here, Indonesia and Nigeria. And it really helps those working on food system issues in countries to help diagnose and decide based at the subnational level. We also set up the performance piece, so the diagnosing piece, in which we set out for 39 indicators across food supply chains, food environments. These are the places that you shop or buy food in every day. Nutrition outcomes and environmental outcomes. We set up thresholds and established in countries where they were likely challenged across these indicators, shown in red, potentially challenged areas in yellow, and green is the unlikely challenged areas. And you can just look here at, this is a group of low-income countries, and the second bar is high-income countries. And if you just look at this last set on environmental outcomes, you can see that in low-income countries, there's a lot more green as compared to high-income countries that have red. So low-income countries are doing better at environmental outcomes of their food systems as compared to high-income countries, which is interesting. And if you look at nutrition outcomes here, this third group, you can see that many low-income countries are struggling with issues of undernutrition, infant and young child feeding practices. And in high-income countries, it's a bit of a mixed bag with a lot of missing data, because high-income countries are not collecting on some of this data, which is also a fascinating data point to see the missing data gaps. So this allows you to not only understand what food systems look like, but actually how are they performing across the world, and allows you to do some comparisons. The Food Systems Countdown Initiative was born out about 2021 from the UN Food Systems Summit that happened at that time. And it's 65 scientists from around the world, representing every region of the world, and 32 organizations. And this group decided to create a monitoring framework for food systems around the world, to monitor food system change over time, to hold governments accountable for taking action on food systems, and to sustain commitment. And we organized these 60 plus individuals into 5 working groups: diets, nutrition, and health, environment, natural resources, and production, livelihoods, poverty, and equity, and 2 cross-cutting issues of governance and resilience. And across several peer reviews and consultations that involved people from all over the world, the collaborators came up with 50 indicators that the world could track over the next 8 years, the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. And there was probably about 300 indicators on the table, but we had to come down to a somewhat manageable number. And each group came up with roughly about 10 indicators. And just to blow up the one on nutrition and diets and health, this is showing you where the world is sitting on these 10 indicators, from low income in blue, light blue, to high income in dark blue. And you can see that not any country, depending on their income classification, is doing well on everything. So for example, in high income countries, they're moving in a less desirable direction for soft drink consumption and ultra processed food sales, whereas some low income countries are not doing well on the food insecurity experience or fruit availability in the country. So we really see differences when you start to look across income stratification, but also regionally. This is showing you these indicators by region. And here's just blowing up again the diets, nutrition, and health. You can see, for example, in the South Pacific and North America, we're not doing as well on ultra processed food sales, whereas sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are not doing as well on consuming the 5 healthy food groups of fruits, veg, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. So really depending on where you are, it's now no single region, no single country in the world has a monopoly on food system success or on food system challenges. Every region has significant room for improvement, and countries can learn from each other throughout this process by comparing some of these data. We also feel that without monitoring food systems, without putting data to food systems, they can't be governed. And by having a monitoring system, we show the strengths and weaknesses at the national level, and allow for countries to be able to understand how their food systems are faring. But still, we've got a lot of data gaps. It's very difficult to disaggregate data. We don't have a lot of real-time data on how food systems are performing. So we need a bolus of investment in the food system data space. And we hope that some of these tools and this work that we're doing garners attention towards that investment. But the one thing that we know is that while all of this data monitoring is important, how are people actually faring across the world? Are people able to access a healthy and sustainable diet? So the last 2 research areas are areas that I want to just talk about where we're working very much at the local level and trying to understand local foodscapes and where people are struggling to meet their dietary needs. So this area is really understanding how local food systems are influencing healthy and sustainable diets. And I call it the ground truthing of the Eat Lancet Commission report that I mentioned earlier. We can have global reports, we can have fancy dashboards, but local food systems and environments are influencing what and where food is grown and traded, what foods are available and accessible to communities. And many of the geopolitics, climate shocks, which Jack also works on, urbanization, population pressure is changing people's local food systems and influencing their access. So, we can look at food environments, what kinds of foods are available, what are the prices of those foods, what's the food properties. We can also understand communities, what's their economic resources, their knowledge, their abilities, their aspirations. But how do these 2 areas interact around the access to food? And access being economic access, physical access, as well as social access, culturally relevant, freedom from social barriers or stigma. And this is really the heart of this work, is this access issue that we've been doing. Most of the work that we've undertaken on this ground truthing has focused in Asia, in Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. And I'm not going to show you all of it because I want us to have a rich discussion in the Q&A. but I'm giving you a couple snapshots. This is work that we did in India, looking at the supply chains of 5 vegetables and tuber crops. So potatoes, onions, tomatoes, brinjal, which is eggplant, and cabbage. And we were looking at, on the access side, the physical access side, are these foods reaching markets, and where is their loss? And in this state of India that we were looking at, we found that most of the food loss shown in yellow is happening at the storage level. So we're losing a lot of these fresh vegetables when food is stored, or in the gray showing you transport, which is interesting. So we're seeing a lot of loss of these foods in the middle part of the supply chain. In another study, just looking at in Myanmar, the kinds of foods that people choose to eat and where they're coming from. This is showing you in blue and orange in Yangon, the capital, upper income and lower income, as well as 2 other more distant areas in Magwai, which is a rural lower income area, and Dawei, which is a middle income coastal area. And we were asking people the kinds of foods that they consume and how often they consume those foods. And interestingly, what a lot of this data shows is that in Myanmar, among these communities, and there's some significant difference between high to low and urban to rural, but overall, the diets of the Burmese were quite healthy in that many are consuming fruits and veg several times a week. They're not consuming a lot of these highly processed foods and sugary drinks and energy drinks. Now, this is very different if you go to somewhere like Thailand or Cambodia or Nepal, but you're seeing still somewhat of a healthy diet across Myanmar, and not consuming a lot of red meat, interestingly. So when you look at this dietary pattern in Myanmar, it's quite healthy, from rural to urban to low to high income populations, which is quite fascinating and somewhat of a protected, unlike a lot of other parts of the world that are going through nutrition transitions and eating a lot of processed foods. It's quite distinct and different. This is just another study showing you of a very different question of the kind of attributes that are important when in a peri-urban environment in Vietnam. What are the attributes that are important when they're making food choices? And so, for example, for vegetables, it's very important to the Vietnamese in this environment that nutrition is very high up as an important attribution. Same with fruits. Food safety is a big issue in Southeast Asia overall, across all their foods, but particularly among some of the fresh foods. Taste can be very important. Snack foods, fruits. Instant foods like instant noodles, of course, the convenience is the major attribution that consumers in Vietnam are looking for. So these are just some snapshots of a much bigger portfolio of science papers, and I've put some of these papers up where we're trying to understand this access piece in rural and mainly peri-urban food environments. But interestingly, we're capturing a lot of this data at one point in time. But a lot of these places, particularly Asia, is so rapidly changing, going through huge demographic transitions, epidemiological transitions, and nutrition transitions, moving away from less undernourishment and more overweight and obesity. And the food environments and food systems and access issues are responding to that. So while we capture some of these case studies at moments in time, they're highly evolving and rapidly changing across the entire area. And so what we're learning is that in these local food systems, while global agendas and important data exercises are relevant, what really matters is context. And we really need to understand where people in resource-constrained, climate-vulnerable places, where they're having challenges in accessing healthy and sustainable diets. And overlaying that, some of the context challenges of culture, traditions, local modes of production and value chains, and malnutrition burdens. It's a very dynamic space to work in at the local level, but one that is so critically important if we want to prioritize the most vulnerable and marginalized that I had mentioned earlier. Now, the last area are these climate-impacted geographic poverty traps. Now, this is a newer area that we're looking to explore, and that the idea is it's somewhat of a term used in the economic literature around poverty traps, and geographic poverty traps are areas that are either geographically isolated or remote, or people are very overly dependent on the geography and the natural resources that come from that geography. Take a riverine community, for example, or a forest community, or pastoralists that are reliant on the desert landscape. And often these places lack services, infrastructure that make it hard for these communities to escape. And what we're trying to understand when we want to explore and analyze how climate change will further exacerbate these geographic poverty traps, and how these traps could further impact food security and nutrition outcomes, leading to deepened nutrition-based poverty traps that limit the opportunity for some of these populations to adapt to climate change. And so we've been doing some work in these very geographically specific areas in which the communities are very much dependent on these areas. So one is in the lower Mekong of Cambodia, in which we're trying to understand how riverine communities are adapting to a changing Mekong flows, change of climate on these rivers. And it's interesting because rivers, food is moving under them, food is traded on them, and food is grown around them. And as climate is impacting the Mekong River, as well as upstream dams and other decisions made by shared countries that are dependent on this river, it's really impacting the food security of those living in the lower Mekong. And so we're trying to understand the sustainability of these food environments, of these riverine communities in Cambodia. Another project is working with herders in Mongolia, trying to understand the perspectives of herders who are herding their livestock and dealing with very extreme events like zuds, these extreme cold events, or heavy rains and floods, or heat stress and drought. And Mongolia is a very interesting place. It's a landlocked, very geographically special area. And we've been working with some of the herders in Mongolia, trying to understand their perceptions of climate change and how it's influencing their livelihood. And you can see here, depending on where they are in the high mountains to the deserts, these are some of the stresses perceived by herders as the climate is changing. And there's all kinds of complex stressors that they're having to deal with. And how do they adapt to these stresses? And the last is we've been working in East Africa with pastoralist communities who are some of the most politically and economically marginalized. And this is in Kenya. And we put cameras in the hands of these pastoralists and asked them what was the biggest constraints for them from a climate perspective, and what were the major instigators of conflict between tribes. So this is on the top are Turkana and the Borana, and many of them took pictures really, and here's some photos showing you them describing some of the largest issues they have that are instigating conflict. And most of it is land issues. It's not food and water, but it's more land competition, particularly with government buying up land for conservation. So they have less land to graze on, and they're competing with each other for that land. So some of the lessons that are coming from this work are people who are experiencing poverty traps in very distinct places. And our big lesson here is that for climate and nutrition vulnerable communities, they should be highly involved in the research and how they are experiencing climate change in the places where they live. So all of this work that we've been doing in Cambodia, Mongolia, and Kenya very much is in partnership with the communities in understanding their struggles with poverty and how climate is worsening their situation. So that way we can come up with adaptation strategies that they produce and that we support them in producing those to be able to escape those poverty traps. So this is more newish work, but one that's quite rewarding, and that we're getting to work with some of these communities who've always not been listened to. They've often been marginalized and not included in plans about their future. So I just want to end with just a couple more slides, and this will be very short. And I think for many of those who are in joining the call today, we are predominantly researchers, and it's interesting because 40, 50 years ago, climate scientists informed the US government about climate change, and we did nothing about it. And I think it was the same with early days of NASA, where we saw the devastating Challenger accident in which scientists had warned that something could go wrong. And I think we as researchers need to constantly push for this idea of integrating evidence into policymaking. And we can't give up on that. We're at a time right now politically in the United States when facts and evidence are under scrutiny, sometimes openly disregarded purposefully as suspect or turned around and put as misinformation. But we as scientists need to stay the course and know that research has an important role to play in charting a positive path for global food security and sustainable development. Research can bring wholesale changes to attitudes, political thought, and action. And I like to hang on to that idea of hope, in that ensuring that hope can maybe be unrealistic, but to me, hope is that we have a path for our future, and research and evidence and data is an important part of that path. And we just need to sit at the table that policymakers set and not wait for policymakers to come to us asking for data. And I just want to end with this picture. The buffalo is such an incredible story of coming back. And while it seems like we are in dark times right now with climate and the political, situation that we're in, the buffalo were pretty much decimated, as well as the people that so much were in kinship with buffalo. And it's an incredible story of conservation and Native American populations bringing back these majestic creatures to the US plains. And it's a sign of hope that if a population that is once decimated can come back from the brink, maybe we also have a positive path forward. And this is just the people that I work with, amazing team of scholars, mainly women, Jack, interestingly. And a whole host of collaborators that you'd find on our sites of people from around the world that have been quite incredible. Funding sources, and I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so very much, Professor Fanzo, for your really fantastic lecture. And this is just so inspiring and stimulating. Yeah, so I think this is the really remarkable. Now it's time for questions. Again, the audience is welcome to post question in the Q&A box. And I already see some question there. So the first one from Amani, we also, and thanks for the presentation. Can we access your food system dashboard freely? It's open
Absolutely.
access. Yeah.
Yeah, it's completely open access. It's very easy to remember. It's foodsystemsdashboard.org. So you can go there, you can play with the data. We welcome feedback. And right now we actually have a competition of who can effectively use the dashboard to answer an interesting question. And you could submit the exercise that you do, and there's actually a prize for $2,000 for that. We've done this before, and it's great for teachers and students because the class could do an exercise and win the competition. So go to that too.
Yeah, that's great. Bill also asked me to mention that your food archives and food bites blog, and he even provided a web link there. So we'll make sure this link can be sent out to those who are interested in. Just contact us, we can provide the link to those people. Okay. By the way, the video will be online after the lecture. So for those who like to watch again, or other people who had schedule conflict, they're welcome to do so. And also from Amani again, a follow-up question is, you mentioned lack of the real data. How do we ensure those data are available on time?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Amani. We don't often have food system data on time. A lot of the data that you'll see, some of it's collected annually by FAO Stat in collaboration with governments, but some data is collected every 3 or 4 years. So, for example, when the Ukraine-Russia crisis happened, two countries, major bread baskets who produce wheat, went to war, and we didn't really understand how food was flowing around the world. And there was a lot of export bans. Countries put in protectionist policies. Food prices rose up out of speculation, and we really couldn't track how food was moving around the world and what were potentially some of the shortages. So we just don't have that kind of data in real time. It was the same with COVID. We didn't really know in real time how food supplies were holding up. A lot of it was just anecdotal. So how do we get better at getting more real-time, crowdsourced data and being okay with some of that data giving a proxy of the performance of food systems and not being such gold standard type data? So there's a need for high quality data, but sometimes we need more real-time data to be able to take quick decisions, and governments are often navigating in the dark on some of these issues when a shock hits the system. What happens to trade flows and things like that. So it's a real big gap. So it's a great question. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. The next question is from Yuqian Zhang. He said, "Thanks so much, Professor Fado, for your amazing and insightful presentation. Based on your research or experience, do you see any difference in terms of food access and security to less developed countries and communities, depending on agriculture versus fisheries?"
It's a good question, one I don't have the answer to. Fisheries are constrained all over the world, right? And for the first time this year, FAO reported that aquaculture production outpaced wild fishery capture as far as total production of fish around the world, which is incredible. So aquaculture is going to be very important, and how do we do aquaculture in a much more sustainable way? We have China and Norway and US and Chile who are all leading on aquaculture, but that could be critically important. But the difference between crop-based system communities and fish-based communities, that I don't know, but my guess would be that all farmers and fisher folk and livestock herders are quite constrained with climate and other issues right now. There's a whole suite of issues across all commodities. But there's solutions for all of these areas as well. But the differences between the crop versus fish versus livestock, I don't know that as well. I don't know that literature. It's a great question, though.
Well, thank you. The next question is from Felicia Wu. She said, "Thanks for your great talk. And I love how you organize it by global, national, and local. It's encouraging to hear about the positive trend in Southeast Asia in food systems. Do you think that lessons you learn from this part of the world can apply in other parts of the world? Or are the solution very local?"
Good question, Felicia. I think it's sort of both. I think we're seeing macro trends that are impacting all populations, be it rural to urban. I mean, climate shocks are going to impact everybody everywhere, and are already. I think other kind of macro trends are these very highly processed or what are sometimes called ultra processed foods, the infiltration of these foods to the deepest rural areas. You're seeing that everywhere. And these foods are easy and cheap to produce, to make. They can sit on shelves for long times. They're easily traded across oceans. They're tasty, convenient, and cheap for consumers. So these kind of trends, some of these macro trends we're seeing all over. There's positive things too, like people having access to cell phones, mobile phones. We're seeing that everywhere. But again, certain geographies need very different solutions, and there's different drivers of environmental unsustainability or poor diets, certain cultures and traditions, depending locally where you are, and social norms. That is where you really need this local context to understand those needs. I mean, no one consumes one diet. There's so many different types of diets around the world and different agro ecosystems around the world, and people's ability to access these kinds of foods. So I think there's some global macro trends that are influencing everyone everywhere around the world. But I think there's a whole range of local solutions that are very dependent on communities that are living in these specific places.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is from Frederick Nianzu. It's a great presentation. So when you suggested one of the ways to go is to get the local people involved, is it the case that the previous studies have not been doing that? Or if they have, what they have not been doing correctly that current research needs to address when talking about involving local people?
Yeah, I mean, Frederick, I think there's a long history of researchers who go into a place, sometimes we call it tarmac research, go into a place, describe the situation and why it is the way it is, and take data and surveys from those that are experiencing why that is, and not really engaging them in ways and listening and understanding their needs, what kind of research questions are important for them, what kind of how do they want to engage in understanding their context. So I think there's a long history in traditional research of just going in, describing a situation, collecting data, writing about it, publishing it, not sharing results with communities, not co-writing with communities. And I think that's changing. Communities don't want to just be don't want to be research subjects. They want to be active in their future and understanding their context and being very engaged in the solutions that are important for them and that they want to prioritize. So I think those of us in the research world, we have to do this now. You know, we're getting into situations of where ethically it's important for us to work with communities if we want these solutions to be ones that they care about and that are sustainable for them. This idea of just describing the world and pontificating why it is without engagement is quickly going out of style, I would say.
Great. Yeah. Actually, the next question is related to this, but in a different way. From Megan McNash, and she said, "I really appreciate your statement around connecting with communities and integrating their voices into research. Can you share a little bit more about the strategies you use to build relationships and interact with the communities to gather data?"
Yeah. Great question, Megan. And one of the first things we do is, and we are usually having a local partner lead the work. And these are, I'm not talking about more of the international NGOs, but the local NGOs who've already been working with communities for a long time and are sometimes part of those communities. So that's kind of the first order of business, is if, understanding if we read literature of a potential challenge, it's working with those who are living and working in these places, and they lead that work. We often, when thinking about as you had said, the gathering data piece, it's how these communities want data gathered. Do they want to do it visually through picture taking? Do they want to have discussions within their community? Do they want to have more ethnographic storytelling? So it's really having these communities understand or having these communities really dictate the kind of methods that would garner and express their concerns and views of collecting data and research. So a lot of the methods that we use are what communities, the kind of methods that they want to use to tell their stories. And then of course, co-writing, co-analyzing with local researchers, of course, leading on the publishing, and us supporting that as much as we can. So yeah, I mean, if you see the Mongolia work, that was all led by local Mongolian researchers who really understood the herding populations. They came from herding populations, and the herders wanted certain ways of collecting information to get at their perceptions of climate stress.
Great. Thank you so much. This question, next question is from Bill Clark of Harvard. He made a suggestion, asked me to share your website, the link to the audience. And his question is that who are your key users, and how are you going, to uh, get the data when the situation is bad, and when the budget is bad, when
Mm.
the political situation change, and how you're going to help those users for
Yeah.
your data.
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. I think in the dashboard, we've had that now, it's in its fifth year, with really shoestring budget. And it's a lot of people volunteering their time, but that doesn't mean it's always going to stay that way. And it's hard to get money for data exercises in general. Um, but we've somehow managed to do it. But, I would say I think the dashboard is appreciated, but it's not hitting all the right audiences. We know a lot of researchers use it, and that was not our primary audience. It was supposed to be policymakers, but we know that a lot of researchers use it. But we also don't really know all the time who's using it. We've tried to capture users, and it's very hard um, to understand who's really using it for decision making. We've had a few examples in countries, but yeah, so the sustainability issue of dashboards is one of concern, and your point is very well taken. And the users, it's hard because it's a crowded space of data tools and platforms. So we're always trying to put it into the spotlight with policymakers, whether we're at a big UN meeting or COP or things like that, where we know there's going to be a lot of policymakers there. So we try to drive certain users towards the site at pivotal moments in time, political moments. But it's difficult. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. There's a big team behind the dashboard constantly trying to keep it in the spotlight.
Yeah, thank you. Last question, because we're already over time up already. From Erickson, Kagemi, have you come across any data on what the government has done to help support areas that have been affected by supply chain shocks, especially in areas that the hurricanes have hit? Also, how has the government aid in how this area to help prepare for food supply chain shocks?
Yeah. Short answer, Erickson, not really. I mean, if you look at Hurricane Helen and Milton, again, it kind of goes a little bit back to that real-time data. We don't really know how food supplies are faring. My parents are near Asheville, and I know only anecdotally that there's not a lot of food in the markets, and there's certainly not any fresh foods. So they're relying on these processed foods and canned foods. And because roads are blocked, limited gas, limited power. But you don't see that data captured in real time. Again, crowdsourcing can become important in these types of disasters. And we, as the food system data community, need to start using these new data tools in a better way, using AI, using crowdsourcing, other kinds of data tools to be able to at least estimate what's happening in places that have been hit by a shock. But no, unfortunately, we don't. We've got a few early warning systems like FuseNet that's in place for droughts and flooding, but again, slow to act, slow to move. Governments are very slow to move on these things. We have the Sudan situation. This has been coming for a long time, and FuseNet's been doing early warnings on this for a while, and there's very little action. So, yeah, there's the data problem, but there's also the inaction problem.
Well, thank you so very much again. The presentation and Q&A are so interesting, but we're already 10 minutes over. So I will have to say goodbye now, and also thanks the audience for this really active participation. So everybody, so thank you so much. Bye bye. Have a nice day or evening, depending where you come from. Yeah.
Thank
So.
you.